we'll start with this. Well, it appears that Clarissa Shields, two-time undisputed three-division champion Clarissa Shields, is having a bit of back and forth with her old buddy Shakur Stevenson, two-division champion Shakur Stevenson, in reference to his fight, his upcoming fight, which is supposed to be his upcoming fight, with Oscar Valdez going head-to-head with Katie Taylor versus Amanda Serrano. Their long-anticipated showdown, and, back and forth, what it seems to have been about was which fight is bigger. And according to Shakur, he stated, our fight is the bigger fight, though. He shouldn't have said that, though, I feel ya. And, I think about that. And is Shakur Stevenson versus Oscar Valdez, is that the bigger fight? Bigger is a description. Bigger in terms of relevance, bigger in terms of historical significance. What makes the Shakur Stevenson versus Oscar Valdez fight a bigger fight than the Taylor versus Serrano fight? I mean, you really have to ask yourself that.
Is it money?
Is it a bigger money fight than Taylor versus Serrano? And at this time, I can't give you an answer because technically, Stevenson versus Valdez isn't even done. According to Shakur, Oscar hasn't signed the contract yet. Even when he does, we don't know what both those boys stand to make for that fight. So I can't tell you here and now if Stevenson versus Valdez is even a bigger money fight than Taylor versus Serrano. It could be.
I don't know. Amanda Serrano says she wants 7 figures for this fight.
And who knows what Katie Taylor's supposed to be getting for it. Katie Taylor didn't all of a sudden just now start making 7 figures a fight.
Yeah, she's been making those kinds of prices.
I don't know what Amanda and Katie stand to make for their inexorable showdown, though it's conceivable that the both of them could very well be making 7 figures for that fight. And while the same rings true for Stevenson versus Valdez, if there's a discrepancy, how big a discrepancy is it? Is it big enough that Shakur Stevenson versus Valdez is a bigger money fight than Taylor versus Serrano? I really don't know. Clarissa has stated she's not disagreeing with Shakur, but if you are a true boxing fan, you are thinking of a plan right now on how to watch both, and we've talked about that. We've talked about that here on the channel, that, even though they say those cards are set to go head-to-head, based on where those cards are happening, I think you can watch both just fine. Both of those main events, because Taylor versus Serrano is happening on the East Coast, whereas Stevenson versus Valdez, if they get it done, if it happens, it's happening all the way out west in Vegas. Those two fights, those two main events, they're not even happening in the same time zone. Thus, they may not even be going head-to-head.
I've always maintained that it's much ado about nothing.
Not that those two main events are going to be happening at the same time, though. Even if they were, it's 2022, people. You can have one fight on your flat screen and the other on your smartphone, your tablet, or your laptop.
It's fucking easy.
I do it here all the time. It's relatively easy. In today's day and age, it's really not an either-or situation when two cards are happening at the same time. There are multiple ways to see two cards, two fights that are happening at the same time, though I reiterate, because both of these cards and their main events are happening in very different time zones, they likely won't clash with each other on the night.
But which fight is the bigger fight?
Well, let's put it this way. Both Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano,
they're pound for pound.
Both of them, they're 2 top 10, 2 top 5 rated pound-for-pound fighters in the sport. The same cannot be said for Shakur Stevenson or Oscar Valdez. Not yet. Taylor versus Serrano really is the best of the best in women's boxing, whereas Shakur Stevenson versus Oscar Valdez, that really is just the best of the best in the super featherweight division. It's a great unification match, don't get me wrong, but it's a unification match that's not dissimilar from what we saw in Fulton versus Figueroa,
Better Be versus Vosdick,
Errol Spence Jr. versus Sean Porter. I mean, it's not dissimilar from those unification matches. It's not dissimilar. It doesn't stand out from those fights. This fight between Oscar and Shakur is a run-of-the-mill unification match, the way those fights were run-of-the-mill unification matches. It's not as historically relevant as Amanda Serrano versus Katie Taylor.
And they're talking about doing it in a big room in Madison Square Garden, not the Hulu Theater.
Now, if they were talking about doing it in the Hulu Theater that only seats a few thousand people, then you might have a point that Stevenson versus Valdez might be a bigger fight in terms of size and scale, but they're talking about doing Taylor versus Serrano in the big room at Madison Square Garden. An ambitious endeavor. You wonder if they're not biting off more than they can chew. Better still, the intent is there. That's where they plan on doing it. So is Valdez versus Stevenson really the bigger fight? Bigger, as it were, bigger. In what way?
Taylor versus Serrano has a social media influencer promoting it on top of a boxing promoter.
You heard that right. Jake Paul is using his social media presence to help promote the fight. Simultaneously, Matchroom Boxing, the promotional outfit helmed by Eddie Hearn, Edwards promoting the fight as well.
I really hate how they're turning this into a pissing contest.
Because it doesn't have to be. You don't actually have to choose between watching Taylor versus Serrano and Valdez versus Stevenson. You don't actually have to decide in your own mind which fight is bigger, though if we're going to do that and we're going to have that conversation, historical
significance has got to go to Taylor versus Serrano.
The more historically significant fight, the more important fight is Taylor versus Serrano. Both of these fights have been years in the making, but this fight is more significant. This fight is for all the marbles. This fight is for the undisputed lightweight championship, whereas in Valdez versus Stevenson, there are only really 2 alphabet titles on the line in that fight. So in terms of historical significance, Taylor versus Serrano is the bigger fight. In terms of size, scale, and finance, we won't have those answers until after both fights are over. When the attendance is tallied, the fighters' purses, we won't know in terms of size and scale.
Which fight is bigger and by how much?
I don't know that Shakur Stevenson and Oscar Valdez are getting something like $2 or $3 million apiece for that fight. I don't know that because when Artur Beterbiev fought Alexander Vozdik, all they got was $1.5 million apiece for that unification match, and that's right around the same neighborhood.
Might be in the same neighborhood as what Katie and Amanda are getting.
So when you say bigger, how much bigger? Marginally bigger?
What are we doing? We're splitting hairs now?
Ultimately, for me, it's much ado about nothing, but I will say that it's not set in stone. It's not exactly a foregone conclusion that Stevenson versus Valdez is a bigger fight than Taylor versus Serrano. If it is, what's that based on?
Based on what?
Welterweight news ahead of his big comeback fight with Mario Barrios. Keith Thurman defends pay-per-view price point of Barrios fight. Bubblegum ain't 25 cents, no more.
Yeah, you're not a champion anymore, so why should anybody pay to see you fight?
2022, COVID, so much has changed in the world, Thurman told Behind the Gloves. Go buy groceries. How much do your groceries cost today? You're going to spend $80 buying groceries. You're going to spend $40 putting water in the refrigerator, okay? You want to talk about prices? You're going to make me want to put the political hat on, and I'm going to start talking about the value of the U.S. dollar. I'm going to start talking about how bubblegum ain't 25 cents no more. That's fact number one.
So you're saying we should pay $80 to see 2 guys coming off a lost fight because of inflation?
So then why are we still getting better fights than this one without an $80 cover charge?
Well, he says he's going to put on his political hat.
Because of how much people like politicians.
Not because a politician would never lie, right?
Right. He added, let's get into another fact. Let's look into February 5th. What do you get? You're not just getting Keith Thurman versus Mario Barrios. This is not Sean Porter versus Terrence Bud Crawford, where nobody wants to watch the undercard. This is one of the most stacked undercards of the year. I cannot guarantee that my next fight will have an undercard as stacked as this fight. I'm going to be backstage warming up, watching every single fight. It's going to be a great night of boxing. From the moment that the pay-per-view hits, you have action-packed fights. This is not just the Thurman show. I would love to take all the credit, but the roster that we have is tremendous. I'm looking forward to sneak peeking these fights backstage. I'm also going to have my head right. I'm going to focus on my fight, but there's going to be some stuff that you're not going to want to miss. And Keith calls this card stacked, but what's it stacked with?
Stacked with guys coming off of losses.
Keith Thurman's coming off a loss. Mario Barrios is coming off a loss.
Julio Santa Cruz, too.
And Luis Neri. He got knocked out in his last fight by Brandon Figueroa. He went on to say, I want my fight to be the best fight of the night, but I can't guarantee that on this card, okay? I can't guarantee that. I'm going to put on a terrific performance, but I can't guarantee that it will be the fight of the night because you just have great fights throughout the night. This is not your average pay-per-view. This is not where you're just buying Floyd Mayweather. This is not just where you're buying one fight. It's a stacked card. And when you take that into consideration, I think you'll understand why we are asking for $75 for this pay-per-view. This is just a night of boxing that fight fans are not going to want to miss. Anybody that wants to shake up their nights of COVID every night, they want to keep it safe. They don't want to go to the club. They don't want to be out. Buy the fight. Invite some friends over. Make them give you $10. It'll keep the burden away from you. Tell them to bring a pack of beer. Get the fish and chips out. Whatever you need to do, man.
Listen, guys coming off of losses need to fight the same way that guys coming off of wins do.
I don't actually think there's anything wrong with decorating a card with guys that are looking for redemption, guys that are attempting to rebound off of recent losses. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. What becomes wrong is where you start thinking you should put that on pay-per-view. That's the misstep. That's the mistake, because generally, pay-per-views are for the biggest of big fights. In an ideal world, pay-per-view is reserved for the biggest of the big names. in the sport of boxing, the biggest of the big fights, and this is not that. This is not something that we've been waiting for, asking for, working towards, fight by fight, year by year. Keith Thurman has been out of action for over 2 years. Mario Barrios, when last in action, was knocked out at 140 pounds. So who
the fuck are you trying to kid?
When a fight between two welterweights, both coming off of losses, one inactive the last 2 years, comes with a cover charge that's the same price point as a Canelo Alvarez fight, an undisputed super middleweight title fight. When your fight's got the same kind of price point that his fight's got, something's wrong, and what that denotes is a lack of quality control, because your fight is not on the scale of his fight. There's not as much on the line in your fight as there was in his fight, yet your fight costs the consumer the same amount of money.
The fuck's he trying to kid?
Think about who's on this undercard. You got Luis Neri, who we last saw in action against Brandon Figueroa, back when Luis Neri was an unbeaten champion. And last I checked, that fight with Brandon wasn't a pay-per-view, but this one is. So you're telling me this guy loses his last fight, loses his belt, gets knocked the fuck out, so that in his very next fight, I gotta pay $80 to see him?
Hey, why don't you kiss my ass 80 times?
Leo Santa Cruz, who has not boxed in a full year's time. He hasn't boxed since he was stopped at super featherweight by Gervonta Davis for what was the WBA super featherweight title. He sat out all of last year. What kind of momentum does he have? What kind of excitement has he generated in the last 12 months to where you need to see...
No, you need to pay $80 to see him.
Hey, why don't you kiss my ass 80 times?
Seriously, these guys are mental. There's no quality control over there. They're charging you. They're essentially charging you the same amount of money for this fight, for this card, that they just charged you for an undisputed super middleweight title fight with one of boxing's biggest stars, Canelo Alvarez. They want you to pay for this card what you paid for that card, even though nobody on this card has the celebrity. And these fights, they're not on the same scale, the same scope, the same realm as that fight was. You think about what they've got coming up. They've got the Errol Spence Jr. versus Yordenis Ugas welterweight unification match, and there's a better argument for that fight to be a pay-per-view.
Man, in this shit.
And what about what the rival promoters are putting on? We just talked about Shakur Stevenson versus Oscar Valdez. Those are two unbeaten, two division champions set to lock horns with each other, and it's not a pay-per-view, so why is this?
Top Rank's trying to put together another unification match at light heavyweight.
What are you going to tell me? That Thurman versus Barrios is a better fight than those fights? That Thurman versus Barrios is value for money, and those fights ain't?
What are you on, drugs?
Must be some hard ones if that's what you're trying to convince me of, and it's not working. I have no intention of purchasing the Thurman versus Barrios pay-per-view that's happening the same night as a DAZN card that won't cost me $80 fucking dollars.
What are you on, drugs?
I'm gonna straight talk this one. To the consumer, it doesn't actually matter why a fight like this with these fighters, it doesn't matter why it ends up on pay-per-view, whether it's to satisfy the fighters' price demands, the kind of money the network won't give them up front because they ain't good for it, so they'll just stick them on pay-per-view, hoping that me and you will foot the bill. That doesn't actually matter to the consumer. It doesn't matter that perhaps it's just the PBC trying to meet their agreement with Fox to stage 4 to 5 pay-per-views annually. None of that matters. The only thing that matters to the consumer is whether or not it's worth it.
And this card ain't worth it. I get better fights than this. It don't cost $80.
Simple. Finally, ahead of this weekend's middleweight contest, Eubank Jr. says Golovkin is number 1 on my list, and he still wants a Billy Joe Saunders rematch. He says it's not out of my mind. There's too much public interest, too much history, too much bad blood. If that fight can be made at some point, absolutely. I would never turn it down. I would love to avenge the Billy Joe Saunders loss. I don't think he beat me in that fight. I definitely know that he won't beat me in a second fight, in the rematch. That's definitely a fight that can happen in the not too distant future.
Chris Eubank Jr. is confident that as long as the purse is high enough, he can entice Billy Joe Saunders back into the ring.
It's not like he's officially retired. He hasn't.
We haven't seen him since Canelo Alvarez caved in his eye socket. He allegedly suffered a fractured orbital bone. And, we haven't seen him since then, but he hasn't called it a career. He hasn't officially retired, so who really knows? As far as a Golovkin fight, Network and promotional politics could prevent that from happening. When I see Chris Eubank Jr. still throwing that guy's name around, even after he's officially signed to Sky Sports, Boxer, and Wasserman, and just that entire situation, I ask myself, is he not aware that Golovkin's still under contract with Matchroom and DAZN? Is he not aware that even beyond a Murata fight, whenever that gets rescheduled, in all likelihood, if Golovkin's going to fight somebody, it might be Jaime Munguia?
Gennadi's only 3 fights into his 6-fight deal.
A 6-fight deal that has since been amended. There were changes made to Gennady Golovkin's original agreement with DAZN, Matchroom, I assume. And, if he is a network and promotional free agent, then they can do the fight. Then they can do the fight between him and Chris for what would presumably be Gennady's IBF and WBA titles, so long as he beats Ryota Murata, takes that guy's belt. If Gennady's a network and promotional free agent, they can do the fight. But if he's not...
You better call Billy Joe Saunders and see what he's doing.
As stated, we haven't heard a whole lot from Billy Joe Saunders since he got his eye caved in by Canelo Alvarez. Don't know what his situation with Matchroom is at this time, his promotional situation, if there's even a situation at all. For all we know, maybe at this time, Billy Joe Saunders is a network and promotional free agent, free to field offers from a Sky Sports and Boxer that might be interested in doing that fight, doing that rematch.
You see they're doing the Amir Khan versus Cal Brook grudge match.
Seems like a fight they'd want to put on. Familiar faces, familiar fighters. Sky Sports is still very much in the business of boxing, looking to carve out their own lane now that they have since parted ways with Matchroom. I should say, since Matchroom parted ways with them and went all in with DAZN.
Sky Sports needs fighters.
Familiar ones. And while the boxing community at large in the United Kingdom might very well be familiar with Chris Eubank Jr., what about his dance partners? What about his opponents? Beyond this upcoming Liam Williams fight, who does he fight after that? What can they do for him? If Billy Joe Saunders at this time is a network and promotional free agent, he can very much benefit from this situation because I'm sure Sky Sports would be willing to throw that guy a couple of quid. $2 million. Pounds, I should say.
To get him in the ring with Chris. Yeah, they would.
The weight would be an issue because I don't think Billy Joe Saunders can make middleweight anymore.
Yeah, that fight might have to take place at super middleweight.
Assuming Chris beats Liam.